I think everybody recognizes that populations change over time. Right? Even young Earth creationists, this is going to be a little episode of critiquing creationism, but young Earth creationists fully acknowledge that populations don't stay exactly the same over time. They're changing. In fact, they need them to change, right? They say that there is a particular type of organism that was preserved on Noah's Ark, or that God created at the beginning. He created kinds of organisms, but those exact kinds aren't, like when we look around, the exact forms that we see today, right? And that's because the world has changed, since the original creation, especially the young Earth creationist viewpoint, where you have this global flood that destroyed the world and then created post-flood climates that didn't exist before the flood. And yet we have organisms that are well adapted to those things. That's why the picture of the Arctic fox here. This comes from a previous video that I did, in which I talked about how do organisms change, thinking about the mechanism of that change within a young Earth creationist perspective. How do they go from a pair of dogs on the ark, and then after they step off the ark, they become 100 different species, each of which they're with their own unique character sets, right? With their own exclusive set of variations in their genes, all in different packages that we call species. So thus my title here, How Did You Become Me? And I threw out this provocative, I coined this provocative phrase, Young Earth Accelerated Theistic Evolution. And I'm going to talk about that again a little bit here in a much more condensed way. That last video was kind of a long slog, kind of me just kind of like processing my thoughts on this concept. And now I have found a paper. I've just run across an article on Creation Ministries International that was published today. And I'm just glancing through it. I suddenly realize this person's actually must believe this idea that I came up with, Young Earth Accelerated Theistic Evolution. So I'm going to show you how this particular Young Earth creationist, or this particular Young Earth creation article, solidified in my mind this idea that Young Earth creationists need a form of theistic evolution, but it has to be an accelerated version of theistic evolution, because in other words, it's basically fast evolution. Now, I've used the word hyper-evolution or super speed speciation. There's a number of other terms that are out there to explain how would you get so many species so quickly, faster than any evolutionary biologist would expect. But now I've kind of honed down onto this term because I think it captures the idea a little bit better. Young Earth Accelerated Theistic Evolution. And it'll take me a minute to explain that a little bit later. But the easiest way to do that is just to show you this article and then help you see where I'm seeing this concept and how I think that young Earth creationists need to be more explicit about their underlying assumptions about how change happens. Okay, if that sounded like a bunch of gobbledygook and you're like, Joel, what the heck are you talking about today? I don't know, maybe stick around and hopefully I'll clear it up a little bit. Part of this is me trying to grasp exactly what young Earth creationists think is happening. And one of the reasons it's hard to grasp is because I don't think most young Earth creationists have ever gotten down into the weeds this far. They kind of have hand-wavy explanations for things. This article I'm going to show you is kind of got the hand waviness going with it too. But what I'm trying to do is, in a way, force young Earth creationists to really grapple with, specific hypotheses, specific proposals, testable ideas. I think I'm trying to help out young Earth creationists refine their models. At the same time, I also think that they're going to find this an impossible idea, unless they latch on to what I'm going to suggest in terms of this, onto some of the ideas that actually come from theistic evolution and borrow from their language and adapt that into young Earth creationism, or the young Earth creationist model of the origins of species. All right, let's get to it. Let's take a look at this. It's a very short paper. We're just going to look at 2 paragraphs. So I promise we're not going really long. I have a video premiere coming up in, 35 minutes. So I cannot allow myself to go much longer than that because I want to be there for that. All right, here we are. We're on the website of creation.com. That's Creation Ministries International, a young earth creationist apologetics ministry. They posted this particular article, which is actually an article from their journal, the journal called Creation, which was published back in January 2024. But I had let my subscription lapse, so I didn't see it then. I just wait for them eventually to publish all their stuff on their website. And sure enough, this one showed up. So this is a short article talking about a young Earth creationist who is a scientist, researcher, and sort of his story, right? How did he come to young Earth creationism? And then what did he contribute? But we're going to see at the end, it makes a note that, that's what triggered me to make this video. All right. So he's talking to one of the Creation Ministries International folks is talking to Dr. David W. Rhoda. And he's English, and it goes through a bit of his story. He worked on turkeys. He has a local farm. And, it's talking about his upbringing. So what is his history? How did he come into contact with evolutionary theory? And how did he derive the ideas he has today? Well, as here it says, when W started his doctoral studies in genetics, which he did his doctoral study at the University of Guelph in Canada, he studied genetics and animal breeding. He was very confident that God had created everything. But he wasn't sure about whether or not this was by using evolution. So, of course, there were ideas at his time, at the time he took did his PhD of theistic evolution. So he's a theist, but wasn't sure what exactly is God's mechanism of creating organisms. How did he create life, and how did he create all the diversity of life? So what did he expect? Well, of course, he expected his professors to teach him evolutionary biology, and he would, see what the strength of that theory is, and then try to, accommodate that or reject it. He expected his professors would, pummel him with lots of experimental evidence to justify the widespread confidence in evolutionary theory. But he says in all his evolution classes, the papers he read, he found absolutely none. Right? So he was not presented with any evidence that he thought was credible. Now, I got to point something out here, and I think this is important. He got his PhD in 1975, which means he's studying genetics and breeding in the early 1970s. So we're really not talking about molecular genetics here. There wouldn't have been a very large population genetics aspect to this. He's learning about breeding. He's in agriculture. I know from those programs, you wouldn't take a specific evolutionary biology class. It would just be like evolutionary principles might be involved in some classes, but I doubt he took a full-blown evolutionary biology as a theory course. And so that's maybe why he wouldn't have been, confronted with the full scope of evolutionary theory. He's sort of just seeing, parts of it. And then, I noted that, so when he questioned his professors about evolution, one professor loaned him a book about abiogenesis, or chemical evolution. I can't imagine reading a book on abiogenesis, from the early 1970s. That would be a very different book than you would write today. And also, why is this professor giving him a book on abiogenesis? That is, that's an aspect of where did the original life come from? But evolutionary theory is about how do you adapt and change organisms, right? Once there is life, the theory of the origin of life is a different issue. I'm not saying there aren't similarities or potential similarities or overlap between those two theories, but to think that, okay, well, I need to understand evolution. Okay, here's a book on abiogenesis. All right. Sorry, we got to get to the main issue. I'm already off track a little bit, and like I said, I don't have a whole lot of time. So what is he studying? For basically his doctorate. Originally what he's doing, in the 1970s. There's this problem back then, right? In commercial turkey farming, they want breeds that are all 100% white. If you ever, why would they want white turkeys and not other colored turkeys? Because when they pull the feathers out, all right, they leave dark stubs, right? So, and consumers don't find those very sightly, right? They don't want to see little dark spots all over the skin of their turkey. And so that's really the reason why you would do a breeding probe in order to make sure you get all white offspring. But there's this issue. There's a whole bunch of different alleles in the turkey population, which is the species of turkey, right? And they mix in different ways. And there's, he wouldn't have known at the time, but there's a bunch of probably gene regulation type of things going on. So it's not just straight up, hey, here's two. It's not simple genetics. It's not like there's two alleles and one is for white feathers and one is for brown feathers. And all we have to do is just make sure you get homozygous, meaning every allele in the particular turkey is the same, saying white. Therefore, we just get them all to be white. There's a bunch of things going on. And so what you have to do, what you did at the time, because you didn't have recombinant DNA technology or gene editing or any of the things we have today that potentially speed up the process, you had to literally take two turkeys and mate them and then see what the offspring had, and then you have to find the desirable characteristics you want in the offspring, and then continue to mate them again with other individuals with different characteristics. Look to see what their offspring were, right? So you're looking for the dominant traits in each case that are showing up. But there's often other alleles that are hidden in some of those offspring. And therefore, when you mate them to the next generation, you end up, some of those alleles pop out and they create undesirable traits that you don't want in those offspring. So eventually you're trying to create true breeding turkeys of a certain type that have a whole suite of different alleles that all in common. And that takes time. He goes into a whole bunch more detail than that, probably more than I gave you and more than I should have probably given you, because the main point of all this is to talk about how difficult this was because it required so many different matings, right? You had to identify and remove other genes which might confuse the results. Well, how do you do that? Well, that required reducing the frequencies of genes broken by mutations. There's lots of different alleles that are, have different mutations in them. They're creating lots of other different characteristics that you didn't necessarily want. Well, that's why they're mutations, because they're characteristics you don't want. They're not necessarily bad for the organism itself. Maybe in the wild, they're like, we're glad we have that feature. But for the turkey farmer, it's like, I don't like that natural feature, even if it was a feature created by God, right? In the original creation, and said like, hey, this is what I'm giving you. This is the variation, the good variation. But we might look at it and go like, I don't like that. I don't like those brown feathers. I want to only eat turkeys that had white feathers so I don't have to see that discoloration on the skin as I'm eating it. All right, so again, mutation is a relative term. It's in the eye of the beholder sometimes what a mutation is. But this involved painstaking and meticulous breeding programs involving thousands of turkeys being traced, human beings identifying all these different characters. They have a whole list of things that they're looking for in the offspring. And then they're intentionally mating once, like, okay, I like these features here. Let's get, this hen over here. Let's get them together to breed. And so we're intentionally trying to bring these different alleles together. Then we're going to have some offspring. We're going to look at all those offspring. We're going to pick out things. In other words, we're highly manipulative. This is artificial selection. All right, the definition of artificial selection as opposed to natural selection, right? This is artificially, we are against all odds bringing different allele combinations together, right? Because there can be rare alleles in the population, but they're ones that you want. And in natural populations, they're not necessarily going to come together at a high frequency, right? Because they're very rare in the population. It's going to be hard to find another individual that has that same characteristic. But in artificial selection, I'm artificially going out and identifying them using like some characteristic. Today it would be a molecular characteristic. I'm genotype them with some genetic traits and with a DNA testing package, right? And go like, that individual's the one I want that has the gene, the variations of the genes that I want. And here's another one over here that has like the same alleles that I want. I'll bring those together. That doesn't happen in nature very often. All right? It may happen once in a while, right? But it'd be governed by basic statistics. The frequency at which it happened would be extraordinarily rare, but in the lab, essentially, which is what this is, I'm making it happen at a high frequency. And therefore, I can move along selection, using that artificial selection, I can move along the evolutionary process. I can change this population far, far more quickly in an artificial way than nature could do. All right, that's a little hint as to what the issue is here, which we're going to get to very shortly. All right, so after 15 years, ultimately in 1986, after lots of crosses, right? Watching many generations, more than 15 generations, right? You have multiple generations happening per year. And identifying all the traits that they want, and they made a particular type of turkey breed that then they could copy, and they had enough individuals of that were consistent that they could create a breeding colony that had those characteristics, right? I mean, this is just, what lots of people are doing with artificial breeding. You just think of domesticated dog breeds, right? All right, so what are the implications for evolution? Because that's why we're here. I mean, that's why I noticed this particular article. All of this took a huge amount of labor over many years. Many thousands of turkeys were tracked, recorded for their weight, shape, color at hatch. Only a small proportion were selected as parents for the next generation. Super like bottlenecks each time, right? I have many offspring. I'm not going to let most of them reproduce. I'm going to take a few of the individuals that are the most desirable. I'm going to reproduce those, and then I'm going to create another population from that. So you're bottlenecking everything, which is going to reduce genetic variation. But it also selects dynamically for particular combinations. As Dovey put it, the project required years of planned effort to develop pure breeds for only 2 existing genes and to breed out the many undesirable genes that inevitably came to light in the process. It was plain hard work, even though we knew what to do. Yeah, I'm sure it was. Right? You're really only targeting one particular gene with one product, but there are other associated genes, like when you pull on that gene, because that individual has that gene, that other individual might have other genes that you didn't want. But in this type of breeding where you have like, all you can do is pick the whole individual, right? You can't go in and just pick the individual gene. You're like, I like that particular gene in that individual. Unfortunately, that individual also has like a comb that's a different color, or it doesn't create very good meat, which is what they're mostly interested in here, right? These actually are meat turkeys. And so this one produces too much fat, but it has the right color, right? So you have to select out a whole bunch of other characteristics at the same time you're selecting in the characteristic you want. That's what makes this so difficult, because you have to just do it generation by generation by generation by generation, and select and select and select and select. All right, so he's right. This takes a lot of time, a lot of individuals, and that is only when that takes much time, even though you are forcing the process to occur far quicker than it could in nature. What does he conclude from this? You know where he's going. He says to himself, well, how could, I'm doing this artificially. I'm selecting for these characteristics, and it took me 15 years to get just the one gene that I wanted in the right, combination of other, characteristics. Right? So how in the world would Darwinian evolution work? I mean, how could that possibly work, since that's just random chance, right? That's blind natural selection. Don't get me started on the blind natural selection thing, because of course natural selection isn't blind. That's the part of evolution that is not chance, right? That's the environment selecting out packages of genes and individuals that are best suited for that particular environment. And therefore there are one allele is being selected over another allele in individuals, allowing them to survive better and have more offspring, and therefore increase the frequency of those particular genes in the next generation. So that does change the population. Now, I will grant that takes a longer time, right? That it takes, if the environment were like white feathers were, the optimal color, in this new, these turkeys wander into a new environment, right? Like like for some reason they move up north and are living in the snow all the time. And it's like white feathers might be kind of useful to avoid predation. So, whereas before they had other colored feathers. right? Natural selection is going to select, the ones that have white feathers already are going to survive a little bit better. But of course, they also have all these other alleles, and they have other things in them that aren't necessarily best suited for that particular environment. So some of the white, they are going to survive, but then when they cross, they're going to reproduce and make other combinations, some of which don't have completely white feathers and so forth. It's going to take a lot of generations. I'm going to say tens of thousands of generations in order to really well adapt to that new environment. So I'm getting close to the theistic accelerated evolution thing idea, right? I don't know if you've seen it yet. We're just about there, right? So how could blind natural selection and random mutations produce all life on Earth, starting from a single cell? Now, he didn't need to go all the way back to the single cell and all that. All he needed to do is ask himself, how could two individual dogs get off of the ark? And those two dogs then give rise to 100 species, each of which have groups of genes in them that are incredibly uniquely adapted to the environment. Right? How could that happen? All right. Let's just say that this is the original dog that was on the ark. This is actually something like what young Earth creationists visualize, right? When they think of the original canine that's on the ark. Something that's like got a multicolored coat, because of course that shows that they have multiple different versions of color genes. And, kind of a big dog, long hair, and then there maybe have a mutation for short hair. And then, so then somehow you can make that thing that has like a collage of characters, and you can sort those characters out into discrete packages of specific alleles that make something like an Arctic fox. That's why I label this here. How did you become me? How did you become me? Right? And he's looking at turkeys and is like, I got these turkeys. He didn't even start with wild turkeys. I mean, but if he started with wild turkeys, he would have a wild amount of variation, right? Lots of variation in lots of different alleles for lots of different characteristics in wild, the original species of turkey. He started with, already bred turkeys that were already genetically depauperate and reduced, and then still had to work really hard in order to get a specific, breed of turkey, right? Arctic foxes are not just a breed of, a canine. They are a whole separate species that has variation in itself, but they're a separate species that has a really unique combination of alleles. So how did they get that way? Right? I'm sure that Dubby here probably subscribes to the young Earth creationist, idea that, well, he says it right down here. I gotta go down here. I am fully confident, on the basis of all the genetic evidence I have seen, that every living organism is descended from a Genesis kind, created originally perfect a relatively short time ago. This is exactly what the Bible teaches. I think he probably would subscribe to the idea that canine is a kind, and then canines became all these different things. What this article does is it directly contradicts that idea. I mean, this is the conclusion he comes to, but the conclusion is the exact opposite of what he should have learned from his own work. It's really hard, and he needed to specifically go in and select from offspring to make this really specific breed. Sorry, I had the wrong thing on the screen here. Here's that quote. How do you go from that Arctic fox? How do you make that Arctic fox? Just using his example, it's got pure white fur. It actually has extra dense fur, right? And it has fur in the, that are heavy fur even in the ears. So that is a gene regulation thing where it's turning on that particular gene to make hair follicles in the ear. So that is a difference between an Arctic fox and other dogs. Even if he wants to say that God created the kind and created it perfect with all those different genetic variations for being able to do all those things, how did that characteristic of having fur in the ears get sorted out, because that would be a different gene, a different genetic mechanism than the actual white hair itself, and combined into the package of a Arctic fox that has those alleles all combined to make that kind of basically like a breed of canine. Is he saying that there were humans out there that saw these dogs and they went like, oh, you would be best fit for living in the Arctic because I see this particular offspring and I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to take you to the Arctic. Maybe I see two dogs that have some similar features to each other. I'm going to bring those two dogs together and I'm going to take them to the Arctic where they would best survive. No, I mean, young Earth creationists are appealing to nature, right? They're appealing to natural forces to deal with the offspring that come off the ark, right? They give, that's their standard model is basically there was lots of variation. They had offspring. They randomly scrambled up that stuff, and they got all these different combinations. And then natural selection selected the best combinations, and then they eventually became the different species that they are. This directly contradicts that. This Young Earth Creationist article suggests that can't be what happened. It would take way too long. Dubby's experience taught him that even as an artificial selector, it takes a long time to create a specific organism, right? In which you've sorted all the genetic variation that's out there and put it into this one package. And was best fit for that environment. In this case, the environment was like, breeders who want to make turkeys to eat. All right. But that is the best combination for those. I mean, it's the best selling product, right? So that would be the main thing that's being achieved there. So what is Duppy really saying here? I think this Young Earth Creationist article at Creation Ministries International, I don't think the authors, who wrote this up and interviewed him really thought at all about the implications of what he's saying. They just like the message of, oh, this couldn't have happened by chance. Right? That's all they were thinking. They were just thinking, oh, see, in order to alter organisms, in order to get the features you want, that we want, we have to go through extraordinary measures, and it's us designing, right? This is a design thing. Like I was the designer. Dubby was the designer. He made that turkey that way. He did it through a mechanism of an artificial selection, but nonetheless, he had the idea and he planned it all out. And it took a long time. So I don't think canines getting off the ark could actually make all these things just by chance. Because from my reading of Young Earth Creationists, most of them are essentially appealing to chance. They're appealing to natural mechanisms. They're not saying that God is looking at the offspring and going like, okay, I'm going to make sure that these two pair because these two dogs, they're living here in the Middle East right now. And I just noticed that they both got combinations of alleles that, kind of better fit an Arctic environment. And so I know that eventually these dogs are going to migrate to the Arctic because, they're going to, maybe because I'm going to tell them, I'm going to tell them to migrate there. But as they're doing that, I'm going to make sure that those two then mate with each other, as opposed to all the other individuals that don't have the alleles I want. Right? That's artificial selection, right? That would be God artificially selecting for the unique combinations of traits that he eventually needs to put in together, which are going to take many, many, many generations to do. I still don't think there's enough generations to even do that, even if you were to decide, even if you had God intervening and like forcing every single connection to be made. So then they continue to have offspring over several generations. By the time they get to the Arctic, boom, they've got like Arctic fox features. And then it's sort of like from there, it's like, yeah, you're well adapted, you're ready to go, live in this environment, have a great life. Okay, I'm kind of I'm making light of it, but I'm actually serious. I mean, I'm really serious about this. I'm really thinking through this. And so why am I calling this Young Earth Accelerated Theistic Evolution? Because I think that what they do have to propose, I mean, based on Dubby's, analysis here, they cannot rely on random assortment and, alleles being randomly assorted as you do meiosis and you end up, fertilizing different eggs with different sperm and you get different combinations of offspring. And then from those offspring, you have nature selecting, basically, hey, this environment's really hot, so the dogs that were born that had shorter hair might be a little better off than the ones that have longer hair. So they are more likely to survive in that environment. They have offspring, and their offspring will have shorter hair, except that some of them will have longer hair because it's a complicated genetic trait, right? As W points out, it's like you could like put two things together that have white feathers and then they have offspring and they don't all have white feathers again. That's the nature of genetics, right? The complicated genetics. And it's far more complicated than he ever understood in the 1970s. And so you won't get, right, dogs that are immediately become African wild dogs after just a couple generations, right? It's going to take a lot of generations to generate all the different alleles that come together to make that particular set of things that make an African wild dog an African wild dog and make it completely distinct from another species of dog. I mean, we've got coyotes and we have wolves in North America. Some of them are living in similar habitats, but they're very distinct organisms. They have hundreds of thousands of differences at the genetic level, and yet they all share those, differences. Individuals of wolves are completely different than those sites in coyotes. How does that happen? How did you separate those out and get those combinations? It's not going to happen in one generation. It's going to take hundreds of thousands of generations. See, that's what I don't think W realizes is that, he's fallen into the trap of this is blind natural selection. If it all was absolutely random, then you would just have every organism would be different from each other, right? Every organism would just be different. And we'd just be like, I just recombined with another organism and I created a whole bunch of new combinations, but none of them are any better than any other ones. And so they all just kind of live and we would never collect a set of things in a population that was consistent. But what natural selection does is says like, no, I'm selecting out some of the individuals in this population, right? And therefore going forward, there's going to be a subset of that population that's going to have some important alleles in common that are important alleles for the survival for that organism in that environment. And that's going to shape that organism over time into a group of unique versions of genes that they then share with other members of their species. But that takes tens of thousands of generations if you want to change one species into another as they adapt to a new environment. Okay, so what's I got to go back to this really quick here. What is this young Earth accelerated theistic evolution? I think that what young Earths need to propose is that they need to take a page from theistic evolution and say that God is in control of all things. And even if you can't see that control, there's many different versions of theistic evolution, like many, many different ideas about God's interaction with the world and, divine intent, all the types of stuff. All right. But at a really basic level, it's saying that God has a plan, right? God knows what the outcomes are because he sees throughout all time and is guiding the process of natural selection. And although it might look like chance to us, again, I don't have time for, all the sidetracks here. So let's just keep it simple. Young Earth creationists need to say that God knew that he was going to have an Arctic fox. And so he bucked the odds, all right? As they're recombining those alleles, there's so many things that would have to come together, statistically improbable, that you would get an Arctic fox popping out after just a couple generations, right? And so he is manipulating the process such that he's bringing together particular combinations of alleles to create the combinations that would give you the features you need for an Arctic fox, right? The ears are different, thermoregulation's different. You got a certain amount of fat that's different in different areas. So it's lots and lots and lots of gene regulatory networks that have to be different than other canines that live in hot environments. It's not just the alleles, it's also how they're turned on and turned off, and when they're turned off and when they're turned on. And there's a ton of regulation there. And all of those things are in evolutionary theory, are shaped and shifted very slowly over time through many, many, many different attempts, right? You're creating many, many, many offspring, trying many, many different combinations, and natural selection is selecting the combinations that are working best. I agree with Dubby. Natural selection cannot work that fast. They cannot change one species into another species with this many differences between them, overnight, or over 1,000 years, or over even several thousand years, or even tens of thousands of years, right? Let's talk of generations. It can take 100,000 generations, right, to fully adapt an organism to this new environment. No amount of appeal to bottlenecks and specific environment. All they're doing, all younger creationists are really doing is they're appealing to stronger selection, right? Oh, this moved into this really radically different environment. All they're doing is saying selection was much stronger. That selection is still not nearly the strength that what Dubby's doing with artificial selection, right? He's selecting just specific genes and trying to get those together. But the environment is selecting for the whole organism and its environment and its survival in that particular environment. So it's shape-shifting and affecting many, many, many genes at one time, but it also is less efficient, much less efficient. And so it has to go through many thousands of generations in order to gradually shift and change the nature of that organism over time. All right, so what I'm proposing is that young Earth creationists need a hyper version of evolution. They need evolution sped up to a great degree. And it's not a matter of speeding up, like in terms of like the number of generations, or like natural selection needs to be like just a little bit stronger, or it's hard to even imagine how it's sped up. Like there's more mutations. Organisms are breeding less randomly for some reason. I mean, I'm just trying to think of any ways that you could make organisms change a little faster by changing the basic laws that we know of the mechanisms of how organisms, mate with each other and produce offspring, and how they mix up their genes. None of those are going to work for them. They're not going to find their answer in natural mechanisms. They're going to have to appeal to God speeding up the process. God has to come in. I don't like the term "come in," but it's because for me, God's involved in everything already. But God comes in and is guiding each one of those things toward particular goals. And in order to do that, he's making the improbable highly. In order to do that, he's taking events that typically we'd think of as being extraordinarily rare events. Like, here's these two rare alleles. I need to get them together into this package because that species is going to need that particular allele at high frequency in this species, even though it's low frequency in the original population. How often are those two alleles going to find each other by chance? Right? Those two individuals walking around, those two dogs are like, oh, I'm looking for another individual that has, greater amounts of ear hair. All right. And so, oh, wait, you over there, 2 states away, you have greater ear hair. So I'm going to run over there and I'm going to make sure I mate with you so that we'll have more offspring with greater amounts of ear hair. That's going to give us protection in the Arctic. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. They're going to mate with somebody close to them, but the individuals that are close to them don't have that characteristic. And so therefore it's not going to increase in frequency very much or at all. And so that's why it's a long, laborious process of shaping populations. So young Earth creationists, what they need to do is they need to propose that God is causing those extremely rare events to happen more often, or even at high frequency. So here's 10,000 individuals in this population, and one of them meeting another one and mating and having offspring with those particular characteristics, highly unlikely. But God makes sure that they meet each other. All right, or at least at higher frequency. All right, instead of 1 out of 1,000 times, they're going to meet 1 out of every 10 times, and therefore the next generation is going to advance a little quicker in terms of their increasing the frequency of those alleles. He could also be changing the way that they do, when you have two copies of your genes, and it's like, well, I might have gotten blue eyes from my, from dad, but he might have given me brown eyes too, because he has brown eyes, but he also has a blue eye allele. So I have a 50% chance of getting either one. God, of course, could make sure that there was a 50% chance just looking at it from statistical standpoint, right? Probabilistic standpoint. But God doesn't have to obey the probabilities, right? You could just be like, nope, every time I'm going to make sure the offspring has the white allele is going to get transferred, even though this dog has a brown allele, right? I'm just going to make sure it doesn't get past the next generation, only the white one. And I'm going to make sure that happens in all these individuals in this population. And so I'm going to break the odds. I'm going to break the probability statistics, and I'm going to direct it to be highly improbable. All the highly improbable events are going to occur all the time. And that way, evolution would speed up, right? That is accelerated theistic evolution. ATE, accelerated theistic evolution. And that would accomplish the purposes of rapidly changing organisms into specifically adapted organisms for specific environments. All right, I see my time is up. And so we got to quit here, but I can imagine that I've only scratched the surface of this idea of accelerated theistic evolution. And I'm sort of using these videos to sort of like help me develop these ideas as I'm thinking through it. And I'll make a more, a scripted video, which kind of goes through kind of like the theorem of this, and then provide some examples, and maybe even do a little math with it too. All right. Well, thanks for making it to the end. If you're still here, I really appreciate it. Hit like, subscribe, share this crazy stuff. And because I need some feedback on whether you think that this is something that young Earth creationists should be considering, or maybe you already think that this is what they do believe, they just don't really talk about it, because I don't see this explicitly laid out in the young Earth creationist literature. I mean, have you? Do you see this particular idea expressed in the young Earth creationist literature? I think it's a no-brainer. Like, this is the place they have to go. This is what they have to do. They have to propose this. And so I really would like to hear from young Earth creationists as to why not. What's your objection to just proposing accelerated theistic evolution? All right, till next time. Hey, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.